us. She currently is pretending to be Evan Cash, but we are excited to have you, Raleigh, and thanks for managing the logistics of all this. Are we good on YouTube?
We are now good on YouTube, Raleigh. I've gone back and made you host. Can you remake me co-host, and then we'll be good to go?
Sure. What was different?
I'll explain it to you later.
Got it.
Excellent. So let's go ahead. Let's move forward with our Spanish interpretation. Do you want to announce that, Eric?
Yes, I will say it in Spanish. Existe interpretación disponible al español simultánea. Si usted va a la parte baja de su pantalla y selecciona interpretación en un icono como un globo y luego selecciona su canal español, va a poder escuchar. Y si en su tableta o teléfono usted va a los 3 puntos suspensivos arriba de su pantalla a la derecha, selecciona interpretación español, también va a poder entrar al canal de español. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
The interpreter request to connect the interpretation, please. Interpretation on. By Raleigh, I think. Lancaster. Yeah. Got it. Thank you.
Great. All right. I see my little globe there. All right. Welcome all. I am dropping in the chat one more time link to tonight's deck, so people have that. And I'm going to share my screen as we get started here.
Abby, I see Cynthia Davis in attendees, but I think they just clicked her over. Never mind.
Just moved her over.
All right, excellent. Okay, welcome all. So we are going to jump right in here to, as usual, an action-packed conversation. I want to start. So we're gonna focus on a number of things today. I want to start with just reviewing some of the key themes that came out of the public roundtable last Saturday. And then we are going to do our very best to actually come to sort of land the plane on some things, including eligibility recommendations, short-term mechanism, and then make a little more progress on salary scale with some immediate things to look at, and then some potential next steps. Benefits cliffs, we've got some updates, a little more clarity, and some potential helpful strategies before we do our closing and next steps. Folks on the task force know that you all had, I asked everybody to complete a survey with a number of specific questions to try and get clarity on where folks stand right now. So a lot of our meeting this evening will be guided by that, but certainly everyone will be able to bring other perspectives to that as well. So the roundtable, first of all, I just want to give a huge thank you to the 20-some folks who took time on their Saturday morning to share their perspectives with us. People had really thoughtful contributions to the questions that we're wrestling with, and some really, good ideas. People were candid. It was really helpful, and we were able to ask questions of folks to try and delve a little bit deeper. And the majority of task force members were there and able to stay for the full time, which I want to appreciate you all for. It was a big time commitment, but I think it was really worthwhile. So big caveat, we had obviously a small group of folks testifying. This what we're trying to do is going to affect hopefully thousands of people, and we had 20 or so people testifying. So with the caveat that we don't want to assume that every perspective was represented, there were a few themes that seem to come out pretty strongly that I just want to highlight that I think will help drive some of the rest of our conversation. One is the need to get dollars out fast. That there are just real needs out there, that the childcare, labor market is in crisis. We know that, and that getting some of these dollars out quickly is really important, which may drive some of our other decisions. There were a range of views on payment mechanisms, which we talked a fair bit about with folks. There were some trends that emerged, but I would say that was something where there was more disparate views, and so we'll try and get to that more in our conversation tonight. Benefits are critical. Again, it's not a surprise, we know this, but a lot of people raised it, that yes, salary is really important, but benefits are also really important, and we can't forget about them. People had some thoughts about how we might sequence things or how we might think about it, but that was loud and clear. Another thing that I think generally came through, again, not everybody addressed this, but a number of people did, that a comprehensive and detailed salary scale is important, including experience levels, and that's something that we've been wrestling with, and I think came through. So I want to spend some time on how we may move some next steps on that. And then finally, a bunch of people made the point that there's going to be a need for work beyond the legislative life of the task force. And some of that is just that some of the things that we're charged with doing are just going to take a little longer than we may be able to make happen in, the next, January 15th is our deadline. And, people have one or two things they might be doing between now and then. But also for what kinds of longer term accountability or just support mechanism there might need to be with in supporting this program ongoing, whether that's in the form of a task force or some other form, but that came through as well. So on that last point, I want to throw out. I've been having this conversation with Christina and Raleigh, and they have connected with Sharon Mendelson as well, sort of flagging that this might be something that we want to request, that there might be a way of thinking about this in terms of phases of our recommendations and figuring out what are the things that are super time sensitive given the need to move dollars out this fiscal year and the things that will take, and then what are the things where we could take a little bit more time to shape and move forward, and if we can sort of separate those out into some phases, that might be one way to do it. I wanted to get a sort of temperature check from folks about from folks on the task force about whether that resonates, and whether people are open to some extension of our work to be able to have some phased recommendations. So let me stop there. I want to open up that question. If there are any other big themes that from the hearing that people want to highlight as well, would welcome you doing that. I have linked to testimony that's in that deck, so people can certainly dig in deeper. But if I miss any big themes, would love to hear those, and then would love to hear any just general reactions to the idea of phasing our recommendations.
May I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
What do you mean about, I'm not quite sure of how to give, are you saying on what we should offer as to address later, or are you asking us, do we generally believe that there needs to be a phased implementation process or recommendation process? That's
a phased recommendation process. So I think implementation, like obviously there are going to be steps in that as well, but in terms of, the degree to which do we think it is feasible to meet our full charge as legislated by January 15th? And if whether it's possible or desirable, and if not, whether people would be willing to extend their work to some degree.
Okay, so to that end, I'm fairly confident that we will be able to deliver a salary scale by the 15th. But as you noted, there was a lot of discussion about benefits and the importance of that, and not thinking of them as an or, but an and people were pretty emphatic about that. I am less confident in our ability to have really thought through the benefits portion of this conversation by the 15th.
And would
And
you,
I am also less confident about our ability to make a final recommendation of the mechanism for this year, only because the mechanism for this year has the potential to impact benefits. And I don't feel like we know enough about the benefits conversation to offer a mechanism that will not do harm to people and jeopardize their benefits.
yeah. And we're gonna get into a lot of the content of the things that you just touched on, Marla, over the course of this meeting. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but thanks, Cynthia. No, I do not wish to extend the time. I thought we were charged with at least the salary scale. So salary scale, the mechanism for delivering, and then a number of other factors around disparate impact or potential disparate impact. Those were among the things that we were charged with doing. Are there, I mean, I know this is a lot to ask, and people don't need to make a commitment tonight, but I'm curious as to whether people are open to continuing the work beyond January 15th. I see Rakaya and then Sarah.
So I think generally my answer is I think it's the most responsible thing to do to think about phasing this work. And I think and I'm willing to commit the time to continuing to be part of this work. I think in saying that, I also just want to qualify it with, and also we should figure out what, like, as much as we can accomplish that is the most timely by the end of our, first phase. I think it's really important that we don't let ourselves off the hook and that we just dig in on those things.
Yeah.
But with that being said, I do think it makes sense and is reasonable and responsible to think about this as phased work.
Thanks, Rakaya. Sarah.
I just want to note that whatever we decide about the funding mechanism, getting this amount of money out, whether to people or programs, does take time. And so I want to make sure that whatever we think about in terms of phasing does provide adequate space for anything that needs to happen going through the council, and then on OSCE's end to actually be able to be completed in sequence in time for us to distribute money to people before the end of the fiscal year. So that feels very pressing from a time perspective and not something we can indefinitely extend the task force work on. That said, I do think there are questions that have come up on the table that may be broader than the scope of the work was originally defined. And there would benefit from a lot more conversation and engagement on the benefits alone. I don't feel like we have the full set of people at the table in this task force, even though we have tremendous talent and experience to answer some of the kinds of questions we would need to answer about how this intersects with Medicaid or other public benefit programs. We would need to engage other kinds of people in that thinking to do it well. So it feels like there are some things we can say, yes, let's have a longer conversation about, and also think about how to broaden that conversation beyond this task force is currently constituted, but also trying to move forward on the things that we really must move forward with this year. Obviously, OSCE is happy to support or help facilitate any of that in whatever format is appropriate to take going forward.
Thanks, Sarah. Walrick. Hey, Walrick, if you're talking, you're on mute.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think the points that Sarah just like brought up are sort of where my head's at. I think that it makes sense to break up. So I guess to your two direct questions, do I think that it should be phased? I would say yes. And then the commitment to extend, for me, I mean, also yes, I think it just, there are a lot of meaty issues or questions that are still on the table, particularly around the benefits and this concept of doing no harm, which I think is critical, that I don't think we have enough time to get through by the 15th.
Sally.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo my agreement with everything that's been said. I think that, yes, we need to be very thoughtful about how we do this. But again, as Rakaya mentioned, not letting ourselves off the hook if we say, yeah, we're going to do this phased in, because as Sarah emphasized, there are things that, you know, we do have to think about the fiscal year when it ends and how long it takes to get things done. But with that in mind, thinking about what can we, because some of these meatier issues, it's going to take time. And if we can, you know, pull those experts in to advise us in the, you know, the best manner possible so that we don't do any harm and we do this right, because if we're talking about a system change, we want to get the system right. And as for continuing on, I am more than happy, very passionate about this, and am happy to be involved.
Thanks, Sally. Taryn.
Sure, I agree with what's been said. I think these are really important issues, and I wonder if you know, attending to Sarah's point, if we could try to triage decisions that would be related to the first year or maybe the first 2 years, and then have more discussions about some of the longer term impacts that require more experts and more discussion. And I think too, it'd be helpful to have like another deadline, because I think, you know, a lot of these issues you could discuss for a long, long time. So just thinking through, you know, providing more time, but not unlimited time, I think would be good.
Thank you, Taryn. So in that spirit, I am, oh, Sarah, did you want to say something else?
Sorry, I don't want to take more than my fair share of time, but I do think, to Taryn's point about some longer running issues, you know, there are other structures that exist in the district for engaging some of this work over time, such as the State Early Childhood Development Coordinating Council. We have recently sort of reconvened the Quality and Workforce task force, that not committee, that exists within the SEC DCC. So there may be some functions there that we could carry out. We could potentially stand up other committees within that body to do some of the ongoing work here, and have a structure that has some public visibility and transparency and reporting out functions. And I think at least 3 other people on the task force besides me are part of that entity. So it could be a natural structure.
Thanks. Okay, so to that end, what I'm gonna try and push us to do over the course of this meeting, and I will appreciate everyone else's support and help in doing so, is to do that triaging as we're talking. So there may be some things that that are very important that people raise, that I'm going to push us to put on, you know, in our sort of parking lot, as it were, so that we can prioritize issues that are more immediate in terms of the things that are going to need to be implemented for this first fiscal year. And I've highlighted some of that through the course of this, you know, of this deck. I see your comment in the chat, Christina, about the health or the benefits cliff stuff. Point heard loud and clear. And again, that is something that we'll be addressing later on this evening. So let's dig into this. What you're going to see throughout here, and mostly for folks who are watching at home, as it were, who haven't seen this, the pie charts and that you see in here come from the survey that task force members filled out. thank you very much for turning that around so quickly. I know I didn't give you all a lot of time, but 11 of 14 folks were able to do it. So it's pretty representative of our whole group. And I know that people took into account the things that they heard on Saturday from folks, and your ongoing conversations with stakeholders are reflected in this as well. So first thing we're going to focus on here is the eligibility definition. We've come back at this a couple of times and continue to refine it. Overall, people are on board with that definition. We'll look at it again in just a second. Although people did have some questions that they wanted to address to feel totally confident. The big questions that were outstanding on eligibility, several people asked around how are educators who have ITINs but not Social Security numbers, how are they addressed? And so I've added language to the definition, you'll see in a minute, that expressly says that that educators who otherwise meet the criteria that we've laid out will be eligible without regard to documentation status, provided they have an ITIN or a Social Security number. So that's something that should be addressed. That should mean that any payments that we're doing, whether it's stipends direct to educators or whether it's through people's employment, as long as those ITINs are in place, we should be good to go. And I've noted later where making sure that we're supporting people in getting ITINs if they don't have them. That's something else that we can provide some support on. And then the second outstanding question was around pre-keep. There were a couple of pre-keep related questions in the spirit of wanting to make sure if we are excluding them from eligibility, as we've been talking about, because there is an alternative avenue for them to get that pay parity. People wanted to ensure, are they really getting that pay parity? At the teacher level, there's a very clear set expectation for that. And obviously we want to make sure that, that people were complying. The one thing that I wanted to note on the assistant teachers is that the currently proposed salary scale, the last version that we have and that you all gave feedback on in this survey, the assistant teacher salaries actually outstrip what the and I realize that the jobs aren't necessarily equivalent, but that in DCPS the only comparable salary that we can look at in terms of parity is the EG9, which is the instructional aid. And that actually is set at DCPS notably lower than where we're setting the floor, that we're proposing setting the floor. And so given that P-keep assistant teachers, if they are meeting that salary, then essentially they could be in a worse, they could be at a lower, pegged at a lower salary than what we're proposing in terms of salary scale. And so the proposal here then is to actually not exclude P-keep assistants because of that. Whereas at the teacher level, there's parity with where those salary scale, with our proposed salary scale. So I see your hand, Marla, give me one sec. So essentially, here's where we would end up based on those changes, which is to explicitly to be more explicit about the exclusion of the lead teacher roles for P-keep, with an understanding that the assistants would be included, and adding that language around ITINs. So want to open the floor. Any questions, concerns about where we've landed? I know you've all seen this definition several times and we've tweaked it a little bit. No, I answered your question. Nice, Marla. All right, so I'm gonna say, I think, oh, go ahead, Sally.
Just a quick question about the funding for pre-keep classrooms. I know the lead teachers are funded by a different funding stream, but what about those assistant teachers? Are they funded by the program directly or by a different funding stream?
They're also funded through that separate funding stream. It's essentially it's the equivalent of the per pupil payment that DCPS and charters get, although it doesn't come through the same route. Am I getting that right, Sarah?
Basically, it's a grant, and then if they enroll subsidy children, they are also receiving subsidy funds for those children as well. But it's budgeted for, and the assistant teachers are included in the budgets that they build for the program.
And there wouldn't be any issue with this kind of additional funding?
We would need to figure out on our end how to manage that in terms of how the PKEEP program budget for their grants, but that's completely doable. Yeah, we would need to think through any implications for this year because their grants are already set, but going forward, we could definitely build that into the way we do that process as a grant. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna say that we have landed the plane on just the eligibility in terms of the fund, the equitable, the pay equity fund. And I want to move now to funding mechanisms with a particular focus on short term, to the point that we just made, that short term and long term might end up being the same thing, but either way, whatever we are doing in the short term, we need to figure out quickly so that we can start getting things in motion, such that we can make sure we're delivering funds before the end of the fiscal year. Cynthia, do you have a question? Hey, if you're talking, Cynthia, you're on mute.
Can you go back to the slide before?
Sure.
Where it says child development assistant teachers, but in the child development home caregivers is only the child development home caregivers, not their associate caregivers.
Right,
because it says expanded,
associate
but that says
caregivers.
expanded.
Yep, Cynthia, do you see where I don't know if you can you all see my cursor?
Oh, it looked like it reads all as one. It says and expanded child development home associate caregivers. I'm thinking it referring to expanded home and not the.
I see.
You see what I'm saying? It's the way it's reading.
Yep, I see exactly what you're saying, and I think that I think that was an oversight. 100%. So I will add that as a specific line, and certainly that should be there. Thank you for flagging that.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, this comes from the survey that you all did here. So the full language is not here because it was very long, very long. So you see those little dots, but the blue represents I support the direct to educator option for the short term, and then the through childcare facilities for the long term. So that's what blue means. The red is direct to educator as short and long term, and the yellow, the through childcare facilities as short and long term. So we largely fell in the short-term direct to educator, long-term through childcare facilities. And if you are just looking at the short term, almost everybody landed on the direct to educator for short term. Not everybody, but almost everybody. And I'm going to just go through what some of the things were around the short term, and then open that back up to everyone. So again, while there's general agreement on the short-term approach, and I won't repeat all the reasons for it, although if people want to, to pursue sort of questions about that, obviously feel free to raise that. You all have that sort of side-by-side doc and thank you for that suggestion, Marika, sort of laying out what does this each look like and what does it entail. So there were a number of things that folks underscored about the importance of robust, intentional outreach and clear communication. So moving forward with a short-term option that's direct to educator, it is going to be really important that there's clear communication about these stipends being a first step in a phased process that will ultimately provide sustained salary increases, assuming that through childcare facilities as the long-term option. There's got to be really clear how the stipend was calculated, especially if it's tiered, and we'll get to that question in a second. Any tax implications, benefits cliffs issues that people should be aware of, and ways that we're working to mitigate them, so that's really clear. And then proactive and targeted support for educators that are limiting English proficient or not English proficient, as well as those with ITIN. So they're in supporting that short-term option, those were the things that people particularly emphasized as really important in order to make sure that we're doing this effectively. So then I'm kind of previewing the next thing I want to talk about is this tiered versus flat stipend thing. But before I move to that, I want to get a sense from folks again, like what I am taking away from this is that for the short-term option, for the short term, that doing a direct to educator option feels right for most folks. Understanding that there are a lot of things about it that are not ideal in terms of our long-term vision of really building the capacity and sustainability in the childcare market at facilities, et cetera, but that in the short term, that this is the more feasible option. The other thing that I will just note is that a number of educators raised the issue, and Rakaya has brought this to the group before, but we heard it directly during Saturday's roundtable, as you all heard. There are a number of educators raised concern about the going through childcare facilities and worrying that the dollars would not end up, that they would not end up with the dollars that they were entitled to. Understanding that in some cases that is, that maybe there's lack of trust or communication between employers and employees. In many cases, just that there are lots of funding sources and requirements and complex things that providers are juggling, and that making sure that those dollars get to their intended target is something that that legitimately some educators are worried about. So I want to just name that and note it because we've heard it. It's obviously impossible to say exactly how widespread that is, and whether people's concerns are warranted, but they are there. So I want to just note that as well. So given all that, I want to get a sense, is there anyone that feels worried, concerned, wants to raise a red flag about moving forward with thinking of this short-term option as the direct educator option? Sally.
Yeah, I guess so. I was the 9.1%, I guess, out of this. There were a number of things I was thinking about. One, in terms of technical assistance, we're talking about 4,000 plus potential educators versus a little over 400 programs, not all of whom may need intensive technical assistance. In terms of thinking about equity, access to online application things and getting that assistance and, understanding what they're supposed to do. I looked up at New Mexico's early childhood site, and they've been doing kind of this heroes bonus of $1,500 for all educators or anybody who's been involved for like the past year. And it is an online application and you have to do all these steps. And I saw that, and then I looked back just this week, and there are major issues where people have missed deadlines, and there's, you're going to have to wait until X date to try to reapply again. And so that just, again, sort of made, it was like a knee-jerk reaction of like, oh gosh, would this happen here? And, I don't know. I have a lot of concerns, and I understand where, there are some folks who are concerned about the money not getting to them directly, but there is going to be a portion of this where the program has to give some sort of information. So there is going to have to be this level of trust between employee and employer to get even somebody might put all their information in, and if they're waiting for their employer to put, to verify all of this information, which is how I understand it from the steps that are laid out, if there's mistrust, if there's, kind of these issues, and I don't, again, know how widespread it is, but again, what type of cascading effect are we going to have like that for individuals? Whereas if we can see that it's programmatic, it can be more targeted of like, okay, what's going on in this particular program versus, separate employees. And like I said, that's kind of where my concerns are coming from.
Thanks, Sally. Kathy.
Yes, and I also, we had a informal conversation today with some educators and program administrators. And another concern that I really had not thought about is if payments are given directly to educators and they are in this lump sum, that some program administrators fear that folks might get that lump sum on Friday and not come to work on Monday and essentially leave. And I think if we give it directly, even though I'm in support of direct to educator program, I think that there should be some consideration to go through the child care facilities for management, as Sally stated, and also just in thinking about giving this lump sum payment and not being kind of dispersed throughout some time. And so I do have concerns about that.
Thanks, Kathy. Marika, Christina, and Walrick.
Yeah, Sally mentioned some of the concerns I had, so I'm not going to repeat them. Only other one I'll add, just for clarity, is this one-time lump sum for retroactive work? Meaning you worked all year, I don't know, however we can calculate a year, whatever, however we define it, and you get this lump sum because of the work you did retroactively, or we're giving you this amount monthly based on your employment? I think that we'll have to just clarify that a little.
Yeah, thanks.
It's my turn.
Mm-hmm.
I do support the short term, but I really think that we really need to make sure that through accountability, we make the long-term work. I think that, trust between employees and employees need to be part of the monitoring that we do when we talk about increasing quality, and this is part of the whole. I think that in terms of accountability, when we receive monies that come from the city or federal government, it's very clear what we need to do, and we all do it, even to get a license in a small facility. So there needs to be a way that is transparent and it works for both in the plan to make it accountable for all. So.
Thanks, Christina. And so just so I understand, you're saying that you do support the direct educator for short term, but you're naming those things for the long term.
But for the short term, just for the reason that it has been very clear that we don't have time for the long term as we stand right now, and we are at risk of losing the funding, correct?
Well, that would be the worst possible scenario.
I mean, that's the only reason I feel that is the most, for what I have heard from this group. But a more comprehensive where people really, have good relationships with employees, and we make sure the employees are being fair with their employees. And the employees are also protected, but people are not leaving their jobs once they get the money. There is a whole thing to consider, just as mentioned by, some of you.
Cynthia.
I guess maybe I may be a little confused because I thought we were, I do support the direct to educator, but I thought it was going through the facility, and the facility had to be accountable. I didn't know it was going direct to the employee. So that's why I'm confused with the blue one and the yellow, the orange one, because I know I'm part of the orange crew, but I just couldn't. I guess maybe I got them commingled somehow. But I thought it was direct to educator, but through the facility, because it was easy to phase in the short term that way.
Yeah, no, you're right that there are two separate issues that are sort of overlapping here. So one is, are we talking about a stipend that's direct to educator as opposed to something that is built into a new salary scale? So that was one question. The other piece that you're raising, Cynthia, is it would theoretically be possible to do, rather than to do that that stipend payment through facilities. So give the money to facilities, have the facilities give the money to the educators. There are, well, I'm gonna just preview an issue around a single stipend as potentially actually one way to address a couple of possible benefits cliffs issues. So we'll get to that later. But there may be reasons on the plus side to do a single stipend on that front. So you're right to be raising that as a separate issue, Cynthia. Here's my worry. So what I think I'm hearing then is that there is maybe unanimous agreement that doing a stipend as opposed to building into a salary scale and actually rolling out the whole salary scale, that the stipend idea is the right short term. So even folks who are talking about going through facility, that's not what's at question. I'm seeing Sally nod. I just want to make sure so I think we're in agreement on that. So then the question would be,
sorry, Abigail, stipend versus compensation adjustment, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Okay, great. So then the question is, does that happen through a contractor that would do that would basically do the intake of information, manage the verification process, getting out the stipends to educators through, the various ways in which they might want to receive funds, and then doing the tax documentation at the back end. That's the option that we had been talking about. So the question here is, would that process be managed instead by facilities themselves? And that feels like there's less unanimity on. Christina. Oh, was that old? Okay. Marla.
Until I hear what you have to say about the benefits cliff issue and a one-time payment or not, I don't want to weigh in on this discussion because that's going to heavily sway what I think.
So let me just tell you that quick headline, and then I don't want to get too deep into it because I want to make sure we're moving through this. But for SNAP benefits and also for childcare subsidy, there is a like exclusion for one-time stipends. So your income eligibility doesn't change with a one-time stipend. Now I'm saying that very simplistically, and it is certainly more nuanced than that, but that's the basic idea. And so in those cases, it would mean that we could avoid, in the short term, we can avoid some of the benefits of cliffs issues. not all of them, by doing it this way. And there certainly are also downsides to doing one big lump sum. I will say that the question around people getting their lump sum one day and then on Friday and not showing up on Monday, which is something that I've heard from folks. The comparable program in San Francisco that you all have seen information on, that their CARES program, which is important to note, is at lower dollar numbers than I think we're talking about, but something like $2,500 a couple times a year, which is still pretty significant. They were very worried. Providers were very worried about that issue, and they said it has not played out at all that way. So that's just one data point for you, Kathy and others. Obviously, I can't promise, but just that's something else to note. Walrick. Oh, that was old. Okay.
Yeah, well, it was new, but then you answered, so I'm
Okay.
good. Thanks.
Marika.
Yeah, I just want to underscore that if we are moving forward with direct to educator, the option and the rationale for that should be clearly articulated, particularly if it's about the feasibility of implementation. I feel somewhat uncomfortable about the rationale being folks aren't interested in the center directors. I think if it's we just need a longer term solution to implement something. We don't have the current capacity. I think that we should just stick there versus bringing additional.
So fair point. And again, we're hearing these perspectives, and it's worth acknowledging them. That said, I think that in the comparison document that you all have about the long-term option, that's built in through childcare facilities, but also built into salaries through program level funding versus a direct to educator. In that case, I think those feasibility issues are front and center, and I think were the rationale that most people gave for why they opted for the direct to educator. Again, that doesn't speak to whether there's a direct to educator through the facility or the provider as an intermediary, or direct to educator through an outside contractor that's going outside of the facilities. I want to suggest. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak for 1 second to Marika's point about feasibility, which capacity is one way to frame it, but I would actually frame it more in terms of system, like building the system that is sustainable over time and will actually function well for providers to have this money flowing to them in a long-term way. We can very quickly stand up ways to get, not even that quickly, how long it's taken with the COVID relief funds. We can do that quickly, but that is not a sustainable long-term way to get money to people. If we want to do this sustainably over a long term with money flowing through providers, there are things we actually need to make changes to, regardless of whether the money flows through an intermediary or directly from OSSI to providers. There's things that would need to change in OSSI's underlying systems to facilitate some of that and to streamline accountability for providers. And some of those pieces, we shouldn't just stand them up based on sort of what OSSI and our tech people think is right. We actually will need to engage with childcare providers to make sure they're designed in ways that work and make sense for them. And that will take time. And that is the piece that that kind of system building just does take time and doesn't seem feasible to do in this time period. Which is where my concerns about feasibility come from, where I do think there are some quicker short-term options we can stand up pretty quickly to get money out to people while we do that system building in collaboration with this task force and the community.
Yeah, I just feel like we just have to get the rationale tight and inconsistent.
So one thing I want to throw out is that I'm a little bit, this is probably not smart to do, but I'm going to throw it out here anyway, is whether there is a hybrid option here. if there are facilities that have the capacity and want to be the intermediary, and some of that capacity, I know that Cynthia has raised this, Angelique Spate Marshall raised it in her testimony on Saturday. So some of that is, would we say that facilities needed to have a payroll system that would allow them to track this information, or would there be some other capacity things that might be that might be sort of baseline, and for facilities that want to be the ones to deliver the stipends to their educators, that there would be an option for that. The reason I say I'm loath to suggest that is having multiple systems going on at the same time is often a recipe for disaster. But I also hear at least some people feeling really strongly that going through the facility is really important. So yeah, so I will throw that out there. Marla, and then Sally, and then Walrick.
Here's my concern about the hybrid in the short term. That really will mean that 3 systems will be kind of being built at the same time. One, we're preparing for
the
long term, and then the 2 short-term ones. And that seems to me like a recipe for disaster and delay, to be trying to lift 3 systems really, because the third system, the more permanent one, will need to start to be thought through almost immediately in order to be ready for the new fiscal year too. So
yeah. Sally, and then Walrick.
I was just wondering if Sarah could elaborate a little bit. I mean, she mentioned that there are a couple of things potentially that could be used as a short-term system. And I was just wondering if maybe you could share briefly.
I mean, what I was saying about the short term is we know that there are companies that exist that other states have engaged with and other public entities have engaged with for a number of reasons during the pandemic and recovery to distribute COVID-related aid directly to individuals, as well as in some of our peer states to distribute the kind of stipends that Abby was talking about. And I think you mentioned in New Mexico, a number of other states have done this directly to individuals. So there's existing capacity there that we could potentially engage to do that kind of work, which is different from building out the ability to do all the things that would need to actually happen to run this through providers.
Warwick.
Basically a +1 to what Marla I think said, right? Like my concern was like this idea of having multiple, you're basically trying to set up multiple systems multiple mechanisms all at once. And so yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
So I guess where I am based on this conversation, and again, I'm probably failing at pushing things along and trying to land the plane on stuff, but it feels to me like, I think, unless several people have shifted their thinking as a result of this conversation, that while we are not in total agreement, that there is still the preponderance of the sort of the center of gravity is on a direct to educator payment that is stipends, and that is through a centralized contractor. If I'm wrong, if there are people who were sort of came in with that thinking and feel like there are compelling reasons to shift, I don't want to railroad this, but I think I want to move us along unless someone really feels like they want to fall on their sword on this, because again, if we can't make some of these decisions, we just are not going to be able to move forward to set stuff up, to start setting stuff up. Is anybody who's got a strong concern with that?
I don't have a strong concern with us landing where in the blue, if that's what the survey indicates. I too agree with Marika Brown the narrative that will be associated with it.
Yeah.
And want to make sure that the narrative does not foster that, but instead just talks about that this is truly a short-term fix, and that's all it is. And it's nothing more or nothing less than that. We were not making this decision because of that issue, that the narrative that is negative, that creates a negative relationship between employer and employee.
Thanks, Marla. Rakaya.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the only thing I had put it in my survey response was the access to teachers is hard. And so the communications plan has to be like really robust. And I actually said that is my caveat to my vote, is if we cannot do a really robust communications plan, then we should not do this approach, because we will miss a lot of people. And that's I just want to say that verbally on the record.
Yep. And again, what Rakaya is saying is, I think, exactly what this set of issues on this slide is about. So Rakaya, I think your language is on here. Others are as well. You were definitely not alone in that. So really robust, intentional outreach and clear communication is going to be really, really important.
And right, just to double down on that, actually, I think we need like almost an instructional design kind of system where there's like a webinar that actually you can stop it, you can do this, it tells you what to do next, you can that kind of robust support so that people can move through it at their own pace and make sure that they qualify. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Marla. Marika.
Yeah, so at risk of underscoring unduly, we've seen over and over again that eligibility does not mean accessibility. And I think we have to go beyond the webinars, conference. We literally need field outreach at this point, multiple language, multiple communities, home provider. I mean, there needs to be a lot carved out for that, or else we're going to reinforce all the other government programs that had all the best intentions in mind, probably even had a slide exactly like this during their planning process, and still ended up not meeting the needs of the intended audience.
Yep, 100%. I think that I hear that loud and clear. I think we need to be really explicit about that in our recommendations, that we need to leverage, whether, it's community organizations that have relationships, see what kind of dollars we need to put behind that to make sure that outreach is intentional and targeted, and particularly for our sort of hardest to reach groups. So let's move on now to this question about tiered versus flat stipend. So I thought this is where we're going to start to get more, we may slow down a little bit, because as you can see, there's less kind of coalescence around where people landed. So what you see here is, again, the question that people were responding to is, assuming that we're going through with a stipend approach for this short term, should it be a flat number? So regardless of your credential or your role, if you're in that eligible group, you get the same amount, versus a tiered. We've looked at this in the past, and we asked the question of a number of folks during Saturday's hearing as well. So got some of that perspective that I know some of you reflected in here based on your comments. And we're kind of split down the middle, where there are, if you look at the orange and red are both tiered, supporting tiered. The blue and purple are, supporting or leaning towards a flat, and then we have someone in the middle. So we're really split. Again, this is just a reminder of what this might look like, just to give you a sense. This is the credential levels that we're talking about, and the role. So this is the credential levels and role that are in our proposed salary scale. So that's something like what a tiering would look like, and something like what a flat would look like. I tried to summarize what people shared in terms of why they landed where they did, and want to open up this conversation. So the big sort of rationales for a flat would be based on what people shared. It honors the work of all teachers and assistant teachers equally, especially given the shared strain that all of them have been under these past 2 years. It's the simplest and most expedient, so you need the least information. And that is especially so depending upon our confidence level in all of our data. And that it recognizes potential access issues for earning additional credentials that might have put certain people at a disadvantage, and this sort of is an equity plan that way. On the flip side, the key arguments for the tiered one, that it sets the stage for this long-term goal of a compensation scale that recognizes credential and role. And that while the sort of everyone's gone above and beyond in COVID is, an understandable argument, that it would invite the question of, well, if that's true, then why doesn't this go to everybody in these childcare centers and homes? Because that could be said of, of every single member of the staff. So it sort of, it creates that kind of tension. So want to open this up as to whether there are folks, and in particular, what I'd love to hear is if there are people who came in on either team flat or team tiered, and based on some of these rationales are shifting, because that's what we need to figure out, where our center of gravity can be. Walrick.
Yeah, so I in the camp of I came in on team tiered, but I moved to the flat, and I would say, the point around like simple and expedient is the one that is prevailing here for me. The first bullet point under the tiered side, like that's where my head was at, right? Even if we can't get it perfect, can we actually do something that like sets the stage? I think the thing that the place where I ended up moving away from that is that my understanding from the conversations that this group has had, and even some of the comments in the roundtable, is that I don't know that we can get to like a reasonable approximation or what have you for that tiered option, and that's why I ended up back in the camp of let's keep it flat. I think this second bullet point under tiered, that the question that's raised there as far as why doesn't it apply to everyone? It's a great question. I think that part of it is like the funding itself is not is carved out for this specific group. It's a great question, but the reason for my flip was that it didn't sound to me like this group in an expedient fashion can actually get to some sort of a tiered stage compensation that actually is going to give some reasonable approximation to where we're going to end up. So, and if that premise is wrong, then let's talk about it.
Michael.
Yeah, I suppose I don't know that I had a particularly strong side I was on before, but I think like the big piece that's come through in our conversation tonight that sort of moves me more towards the flat side is just the importance of getting the narrative part right. And I think when we talk about the delivery side, I think having we're doing this direct short-term delivery thing, but also we've managed to set up this really complicated tiered scale, I think makes it a little harder to sell that. And so I think, to the extent that you might be on the fence, like that ends up pushing me much more towards the flat, as I feel like it's very consistent across the board. Like, yes, this is a down payment on the real program kind of impression.
Marika.
Yeah. Is there a tiered plus or flat plus option? I'm just thinking about the experiences we had when we provided funding to keep teachers in the same program, and the infantile teachers across the hall didn't get funding. While we don't have that scenario here because all of the teaching staff will get some stipend, I'm curious to hear from the center directors about whether or not we're actually giving them more expenditures because they will then feel the need to find a stipend for the other employers. Now we could care less about that because of the scope of our work, but I'm just curious about sort of the ripple effect costs we're adding to programs in the process.
Christina.
I actually went for the tier just because I was trying to see how this will look into the long term with the salary scale. But looking into the numbers and the credentials that right now are in we have not reached the new credentials needed to be a teacher. I will say that, and I'm just in my experience that it's going to look more like a flat because we've been encouraging all our teachers to get their AAs and their bachelor's degree. Most of the teachers who have bachelor's degree, they're already getting the pay through the pre-keep. So most of them will be in the CDA and maybe some credits from and I'm just making assumptions. So all the directors, maybe they have other experiences. But when I look at the credentials and I compare, especially for the 0 to 3 and what we have put into the scale, it's going to look pretty much like flat. And, I know we probably have the data to support it.
Thanks, Christina. Sarah.
Just, I wanted to make one point in response to Marika's point about the pressure on other folks for stipends. I just wanted to remind folks that we are distributing, and most programs will get in sort of like late January or February, the childcare stabilization funds, which are putting about $38 million directly to programs that can be used for a really wide range of purposes. And so this may be something that programs should be thinking about at the same time. And if we're doing the task force's work, think about those two things in concert.
All right. So I'm going to see where we are at this point among the folks who are on the call. So can I get indication of, at this point, how many folks are leaning towards a flat stipend?
For those who probably change their minds.
So I saw Rakaya and I saw Taryn and Walrick and Michael.
I'm leaning to Cynthia. I'm leaning toward tiered.
Okay, so now for who's leaning towards tiered still? So Cynthia. Oh, thank you for putting. Okay, so we're basically still split right down the middle, people. Okay, Walrick, you had a question.
Yeah, on the tiered, I mean, again, like what I said before is like, I like the tiered option. I think the thing that drives me back towards the flat for me is that it's the feasibility of actually getting to a tiered option that will somehow resemble or approximate or whatever, right? The longer term, compensation structure that is our ultimate goal. And so is there a way, like, can we have a conversation around that? Like, do we, like, what does the tiered option look like, right? Like, do we have any sense of like what the tiered option is going to look like? And is it remotely, do we have any belief that it's going to be remotely close to the longer term? Yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say, Abigail, like I saw this in the email. What I don't know is like, what does this mean? Yeah.
Versus status quo, sure. I mean, so I think the quick answer, Walrick, is that we have only a general idea of the answer to that question, and that it is going to be variable individual to individual and program to program, because salary scales are all over the place, right? And so there may be some people for whom this additional stipend, does a pretty good job of approximating what their ultimate salary increase would look like. And then there are going to be people on all sides of that, who this is more than it would end up being or less than it would end up being. So I think we don't really know. I mean, it would be more sending a signal that that given the long-term goal of a salary scale that considers credentials and role and experience, which we'll get to later, that this is sort of approximating that like spirit, but not necessarily the numbers. Marla, Kathy.
I didn't have a question. I need to lower.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, your hand was raised from the earlier question. Kathy, did you?
Yeah, I just wanted to just state that I think that in the flat stipend, it is certainly honoring the work of everyone involved, but all the work is not equal. And I think when we take into account the roles and the responsibilities that teachers have that differ from assistant teacher and aides, that's important. And also, teachers who have earned a BA have also probably incurred additional expense in doing so. And so I think that to give a stipend is to honor the work, but the work can't be honored equally because the work is not equal. And that's just my rationale for the tiered. So I'm team tiered.
Thanks, Kathy. And I appreciate actually people noting where they stand. That's super helpful as you continue to make your comments, and especially if you're changing your mind. Warwick.
So I guess now that Kathy, based on your comment, point of clarification, are you team tier like through and through, like but both split on lead teacher versus teacher assistant, right? Because there's almost like a gap or a weight that you could apply to those. So that's one. Or are you saying that you're all the way through? So teacher versus assistant teacher, and based on credential, like full on, like have a tiering, have this stipend reflect that.
Yeah.
That full set. Okay. And then the question that I had earlier around, like, does this actually, do we think that basically, Abigail, what you had outlined, right, is that, we don't know the exact answer as to what the, call it longer term, like compensation will look like. It will be highly individualized. But then along with that, I think it sounds like we're already talking about a really, really important set of tight and very, very well thought out communications that need to take place with any money that goes out, right? If you have a flat stipend, then that probably is one communication that can go out, needs to cover a number of different things that explains what it is, how we came up with it. But then if we're going into the calculations of these individual stipends, like, doesn't that also, in my mind, that also increases the amount of time that has to go into getting that right? And then I go back to this, in the spirit of trying to be expedient with getting the funding out. That's another factor that I think it complicates it, right? It's just, you have to do some calculation, which is going to be what we believe is an interim calculation. It's not even going to be the thing that's long term, but then we still have to find a way not only to do the calc, but then also explain it to folks in a way that they will absolutely understand. And we're going to have to do that on a basis that's far more individualized than the flat would.
Kaya.
I think everyone knows that I'm flat, but I just want to, I think what I was going to say was similar to what Warwick just said, but I think for me, it's the communication. I mean, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of reasons why I landed in flat. I think I've said them all enough times, but the one that I feel like is really powerful every time I come back to, like, should I second guess this perspective, is exactly what Warwick said, which is there's no way for us to even begin to get to a place where we feel like we're possibly representing what the long-term approach might look like in terms of someone's payment. For me, it's much more confusing to say, hey, we're honoring your credentials with a tiered stipend based on your credentials, and next year we're going to be honoring your credentials in a way that might be much less or much more. Like, there's no way for us to be able to assure how close we're going to get to what their eventual full payment will look like. For example, if you work at a center that's paying you really well compared to like the average, at the end of the day, your increase in the permanent program might be a few $1,000s, but the last year you got $15,000 or $19,000. And if we're saying that that was done based on your credentials, and this year we're saying your pay is based on your credentials, that's a very confusing message to try to communicate. I feel like it's a dangerously confusing message to try to communicate. So it's not my only reason for advocating for the flat, but I think in terms of building trust around this program, it to me stands out as a really important moment to not undermine that trust with just a really easy opportunity for miscommunication.
Marika.
Even in the best communication circumstances.
Thanks, Rika. Oh, Cynthia.
I think I'm still pro-tiered. The problem, the thing that I'm going with is that we need the data on where people are in the roles, and our role is to come out with a tiered a salary pay scale. This is closer to that. I would rather come up with an explanation as to why your pay went down or why your pay went up. It's because we had to figure out what that looks like. Right now, it's a short-term thing, and we wanted to roll the money out to you and to get you compensated the way that we're trying to figure out this salary scale. I don't really think that stipend for all, look, we're in a place where I don't want to be treated like I'm a person with an AA degree. I worked hard for a master's degree and I want to be compensated according to that. So to me, I just think we need to stick towards the salary scale. We need the data on where everybody is. We need the data on where everybody roles are so we can get everybody compensated the way we're going to put this salary scale out. I don't think we need to, we're not going to be able to please every single person. We're not going to be able to do that. But at the same time, if we're looking at the scales and the way we're trying to design the scales, that people are compensated based on their credentials and based on their roles, then we need to do that. And if it comes out that you get $1,000 or $2,000 the next year, it's because we will have a better explanation as to why your pay went down or why your pay went up. We will be a lot more clearer at that time. But right now, I don't know the flat rate for everyone. I don't know. I'm just not flat rate. I'm just pro tier. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. And I hear someone else has got an opinion in the background. Marla and then Sally.
So I am concerned that people might interpret this as where their salary will fall next year, because that is indeed not necessarily going to be the case. I am also concerned that we treat all roles as the same. I think I'm now landing on Abigail, but a third option. I am now thinking that I think it might be a different stipend for teacher versus assistant teacher, but not necessarily based on credentials, just the two roles. And the reason why I argue that is because the lead teacher has more responsibility than an assistant teacher. And I think we need to honor that regardless of what their credentials are. When I think about stipends in the secondary space, in the K-12 space, they rarely give a different stipend based on your credentials. So like if you get a coaching stipend, you just get a coaching stipend. You're either the head coach or you're the assistant coach, and you get a different one based on role, but not based on credentials. So you might be a head coach with a master's, you might be a head coach without one. They don't really differentiate for that. And I think that's the way to honor the difference in responsibilities, yet decouple it from the issue of this might be your salary next year and mislead people into thinking something that may or may not be true.
Thanks, Marla. So as people continue to talk, I would also appreciate if you want to weigh in when you talk or in the chat about the compromise. I see a couple people already doing that. Sally.
Yeah, I mean, I've been team tier, and I do like this compromise. I know Marika mentioned it in the chat, and Marla just voiced it. This compromise of a stipend for your role. And again, I want to emphasize what our message is has to be really clear. We have to be very careful, clear. And, you know, as Cynthia mentioned, we're not going to please everybody, but if we are clear and consistent in our message, then I think we're, you know, we've won more than half the battle.
All right, Marika and Marla, I think you might have just figured out our through path here. So I'm want to hear, and again, gonna invite. So I've gotten almost everyone in the chat has agreed to the compromise. I think we are well over a majority. So unless there's someone who wants to fall on their sword against the compromise, the compromise is. Sorry for folks at home, I don't know if it's clear, I don't even see the chat. The compromise is that it would be tiered, but the tier would be based on role, only on role. So teacher versus assistant teacher, recognizing the differences in those roles, but would not differentiate on credential, which would both help with the clarity of messaging. It's just that much simpler to message. Also sending a signal that down the line we are looking at this differentiation among role, also obviously down the line and in terms of credential. So it'd be a step in that direction. We obviously would then want to figure out what those numbers look like and need to model out some different possibilities in terms of the dollars. But sounds like that's where we're landing. Are there any concerns about moving forward with that people want to voice? And Cynthia, Walrick, and Michael, I don't know if your hands are up, if those are new hands or old hands.
I have raised my hand to fall on my sword, if you will.
Mine's an old hand.
Okay. Michael.
Yeah, sorry. I guess like I really I intuitively like the idea of the the skinny tier, the simple tier, whatever we're going to call it. I think what I worry about with this is there's obviously going to be a fair amount of selection within the two groups, right? Like we know that credentials vary a lot within roles. And so I guess my concern is if we're sending, I definitely don't want to send the message that the only thing that will matter is role going forward by sending out the first check that totally ignores credentials. And then I think the other concern I have is, are we going to send a message in year 2 where it looks like the people with the most credentials either did way better or way worse than I thought they were going to do? I think we're gonna, whatever, just to be the full economist in the group, right? I'm really super concerned about these second order issues. But I guess those are the reasons that I'm not 100% on the 2-tier bandwagon. But I agree, it is a solid compromise. I do just think that flat is still going to be way easier to message, just especially when you start to think about what happens to the various people in these in these bins that we create, and then what that's likely to do to our ability to retain certain parts of that workforce going forward. So that's my falling on my sword, and let's move on.
Okay, so what I'm going to say is it feels like there is a strong leaning in the group, and I think I think eight folks at least have said that they're comfortable with the compromise. I hear the concerns that you're raising, Michael, and obviously others had, this is not a bunch of people's ideal spot, not where they started, but it feels like a compromise that's workable. And as we'll do with all the recommendations that we ultimately make in our report, if there's a recommendation that you really feel like you cannot publicly support, you can't put your name on, people will have an opportunity to know why they differ. So if that's something that you feel really strongly about, I certainly don't want people to to feel like they don't have that opportunity to share something that they feel really strongly. But I think we've landed on this compromise, and we'll take the next step there to look at what the numbers look like, based on the data we have, and so what some dollar amounts would look like. Understanding that with all of this, the communication is going to need to be really clear about what we're doing and why, and the fact that this is a phase, and there will be a new phase down the line, where things will look different, regardless of what we do. Okay, it's 7:30 and I haven't given y'all a break. Can people hang in there for this last half hour, or do you need to like stand up and stretch or run to the restroom? People gonna hang in there? All right, obviously, if you need to, go. Yes, say goodnight to your kids, Taryn. It would be very uncool of us to tell people that they couldn't actually take care of their children on this particular task force. Okay, so previewing what we have next here, you all saw again the same credential levels and proposed salary that that we've been looking at with the rationale for how we got to those numbers. And I'm going to move through this next section and then see where we can have some points of discussion. So the questions that you all responded to, the first couple were about credential levels. So are people comfortable with these credential levels being in an ultimate salary scale? Now, so again, reminding everybody that we're toggling back and forth between things that are going to impact the short term and things that are going to impact the long term. So as we just acknowledged that the credentials would not be part of that initial stipend tiering for this first round. That said, we are looking ahead to what credentials we would want reflected in an ultimate salary scale. So just keeping both sides of that in mind. So overall, people were comfortable with these three levels. I'll get to the questions people had in just one second. And again, for teacher level, same thing. People were overall comfortable with the three levels that were built into the salary scale, with, again, a few questions. And same thing with the base salaries. And again, we're not talking about experience here. We're just talking about base minimum salaries. So people were overall comfortable, but a number of questions that people wanted raised. So I want to highlight the questions that people raised. And the ones that are in that, what do you think this is, like ochre or umber or whatever this color is, the orangish color, are the ones that are relevant issues for the short term, assuming a tiered stipend approach. And actually some of this is now not even relevant if we're not using credentials. But I want to just note some of these questions. So one, people had some questions about the less than CDA level for the assistant teachers. And I want to just do a quick reminder on this for everybody that these levels reflect what currently is allowable in terms of credentials, knowing that right now on the books by December of 2023, there are new requirements. Now, we're not going to talk now about whether everyone's going to meet those requirements or whether there's going to need to be, further extensions of that. But assuming that 2023 requirement, at that point, the less than a CDA level would be moot because this would not be an allowable credential. But right now it is. It's an allowable credential right now if someone does not have a CDA, that is an allowable level for assistant teacher. And then for a number of these others, there also will be, some of those changes come December 2023. So the second question that came up, that again may no longer be relevant for the short term, but is how we think about the 10-year experience waiver. The reality on that is it's a pretty narrow set of people. And again, if it's not something that we need to answer right now for the first phase, I'm going to push that one down the line a little bit. But I want to just highlight these are other questions that people raised that we would need to continue to delve into in thinking about what the long-term implementation of a new salary scale with program level funding would look like. So, and this last question is, we should have on every single slide for everything is whether there are going to be adequate funds to support any of these things. That's always an ongoing question. And Sarah is always helpful in reminding me of that because we want to have that on the radar. So is there anything on here that folks believe we need to answer now with an eye towards the short-term, plan and process? Cynthia.
I think yes. I think if an educator has a current 10-year experience waiver, are they eligible for payment at the level they have been waived into? I think yes, we have to address that question because that is predominantly a reflection of family childcare teachers. A lot of them we're over 50 plus, and some of them are 60 plus, and they have waivers. Some of them did do the CDA, but some of them haven't. And I think that's going to be a big issue for my particular sector.
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. So I think if I'm understanding right, that that you're talking about what if we had a credential requirement, which is what we're talking about for the longer term. For the short term, given what we just discussed, if we are just focused on role, I don't believe that would be an issue with what you're talking about, because if they're classified as a teacher, so as a family childcare caregiver, then that's their level, and if they're an associate caregiver, then that's a different level, independent of credential. So I think that while what you're talking about absolutely will have a longer term impact, I think it doesn't have an impact in terms of what we just talked about with the tiers.
But I think what I think maybe I'm not clear enough, because if you have a lead teacher and you have an assistant teacher, that's the same as a caregiver and associate caregiver. I just want to make sure that they on the same level, that there is paired beside each other. That's all I'm basically saying.
Yeah, I think that we're good on that. So
okay, good. Okay, then I just want to be clear. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. So you are not intended to be able to read this. The point of this slide is I asked everyone, all right, so how are we going to consider experience? Because again, we heard pretty loud and clear, I think, at the hearing that that we need to have some clear, not just guidelines, like some pretty clear things established in terms of how experience is considered in the ultimate salary scale. There are a whole bunch of ideas in here. You've heard a lot of them already in our earlier conversations. Do we look at what DCPS does? Do we look at what the federal government does? Thanks to y'all, I went down a whole rabbit hole on the OPM website looking at the federal salary schedule and how they figure out steps, which is totally different from how DCPS does it, et cetera, et cetera. The point being that I believe that everything that's on here gets kicked out to a next step because it is not required for our very first phase. Doesn't mean we can kick it too far down the road, but I don't think we need to resolve all of that right now. And I think that there's a lot of good ideas on here that I think will allow a subgroup of folks to pretty quickly put together some models to start pressure testing what this would look like. So that's all I'm going to say there. And I want to now save these next 20 minutes to get into the benefits cliff stuff, because I know that we keep kicking it down the road. Are people good for now? Is that an old hand, Cynthia? I think it is.
Yeah, sorry.
Cool, that's good. That's good. I just want to make sure I'm not ignoring you. Okay, so you saw this the last time. The quick story is that as people have raised any number of times, the benefits cliff issue is an issue. And as we dig into it, we're trying to get a sense of the scope of it. And there are a ton of question marks because the data that we have, doesn't allow us to, just say, oh, how many people does this affect and who does it affect? We can't know that with any precision. But these two examples give you a sense of the kinds of things that could play out, and what ends up mattering. Again, this is the benefits cliff calculator. I've confirmed with DHS that this calculator does in fact reflect, like, this is right from their perspective, and they are working closely with the Atlanta Fed actually on this, including adding some things that should help from a policy perspective. I had a conversation with several folks from DHS this morning that was really helpful. But part of what was helpful about it was that it confirmed that the concerns that we have are real. So it wasn't totally optimistic, but it was helpful. So I want to just highlight a few of the things that seem like key issues. The one that, based on initial looking, the benefits that seem to be the most likely issues are SNAP, Medicaid, and child care subsidy. Again, with the huge caveat that people's individual situations matter a ton. Whether they live in Maryland, DC, or Virginia matters. How many kids they have, are they single, or are there multiple, wage earners in the household, et cetera. Every single one of those things creates just many iterations of this. In addition to those three, subsidized housing is also something that the DHS folks said we should be, keeping an eye on, given the sort of windows, the salary windows that we're generally looking at. It's also important to note that DC has limited control over lots of benefit programs given federal requirements and restrictions. So there are things we can do, and there are things that even if we want to do as a jurisdiction, we can't. We just aren't able to. So again, have to really pay attention to that. Here are some of the things that have come up thus far in terms of thinking about mitigation initially and ongoing. So the first, and again, Christina Encinas has been our, sort of standard bearer on this point, but I think it's really important, is especially as we start this new program, we want to make sure that educators have information so that they can make wise decisions for themselves and their families. And obviously, it's not ideal. It's not even close to ideal that people might be in that position, but if they are in that position, they should know it. So we need to, part of our communication strategy needs to be really making sure we're supporting that. And not just saying like, oh, here's this benefits calculator that, you can use, but figuring out ways to actually support that process and help people get that information in ways that meet their needs. Second is what I mentioned earlier around the income exclusion of one-time payments that can come into play for SNAP. And again, SNAP is one of the things that we're particularly worried about. That may drive us to at least and maybe there's people can opt into monthly versus one time, or maybe there's some way we can have some mix here, but that for people who are in that position, that potentially making this a one-time payment could actually really help. And childcare subsidy also has some of that same flexibility. If you have a, sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word, but an unusual change that's that's not in sort of your standard salary. So that might buy us a little bit of time. Supporting both employers in seeking out health benefit options. So Sarah has talked about getting the word out around options with the health exchange, especially right now. And I know that for this round, we're like, this is literally it, and it's the next few weeks, that open enrollment is in play, but there are some better deals right now given some of the the federal changes in terms of some of those options, and for employees to know what the healthcare marketplace subsidies might be for them if they no longer are eligible for Medicaid. And that's a qualifying event. So if they were no longer eligible, then they could make use of those subsidies. Looking at health benefits consortiums among providers, this is a longer term strategy, but one again that we've talked about. Some folks had talked about charter schools as a potential model for that in terms of some consortiums. And so I've reached out to folks as the Charter Association to try and see if we can learn from them from some of that. There is the possibility of exploring a blanket eligibility for childcare subsidy for all early childhood educators who live in DC. And again, this, the DC residency is just something that we can't get around, but that's something that we can, there is that potential for that flexibility that ECE has. There's certainly lots of conversations and steps and questions between here and there, but it's at least something to have on the radar, is something to explore. And then finally working, ongoing with DHS and DHCF to explore additional strategies. I just reached out to folks at DHCF, healthcare finance, sorry for all of the acronyms, to ask about whether some of the federal changes right now in terms of Medicaid eligibility, the degree to which that is affecting us in DC, and the degree to which, how long that's going to be, given that these are all like COVID relief, rules. So again, can we buy a little bit of time by extending some income eligibility? So those are things that are on the table. So I want to open up to sort of general reactions to that, and to start thinking about what some of the next steps are in terms of that work. I also want to just come back in the chat to the question. Sorry I missed this before, Marika, about this sort of kicking it down the road on the salary scale decisions. My sense of that kicking it down the road is not like a next year kind of thing. I mean, yes, next calendar year, which is 2 weeks from now. But it's basically that we want to land on the stuff that we have to decide for year one implementation first, before we then get to that next bit. So I don't think that that's a long way down the road. But my point was just that rather than talking about that right now, we want to talk about the things that are more immediate. Marla.
I have a question. I want to make sure I heard you correctly. So if you do lose your Medicaid, it is a qualifying event that will allow you to be eligible to go to the DC Health Exchange past January 31st. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
That's correct. Yeah. Now, whether you're going to find a good enough deal there is another question, but yes. Other questions, reactions on any of the benefits cliff stuff, just at the moment?
I do have a question. I guess I have two questions. I think the first is, this made me think of the fact that we had in the eligibility group been discussing part-time workers or part-time teachers, and how we should account for that in eligibility, which comes up for me again in this conversation, because I think there are folks who will be more likely to use public benefits based on their employment status. So there was that question. And I think the other question is, were the DHS folks, or is there anyone that you can think of who, I guess for me, it would be helpful to have like a dollar amount difference. Like once you hit that cliff, what is really the benefit? If you were using all of those benefits, how many dollars do you lose? I mean, I can see it on that chart, but that is not I guess it doesn't feel specific enough for me, but I guess what I'm trying to say is if we, if we get to that point, are folks losing, like how much of a difference are we talking about? I think that would help me think about the challenge that we're facing.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so you can't see this on here because this is just a screenshot, but you actually can see each of these has a, like when you're online, it has an associated dollar amount. So you can actually see like, what are these benefits worth in a dollar amount, and what are you then losing? So you can see that. The challenge is that that's for like one individual scenario, right? I mean, you can see some of the scale of it. So you can see like, as SNAP benefits, drop off. I mean, those are like pretty steady benefits, and then they just go away at a certain point. So you can see like, this is how much less you get in, your ability to feed your family. So yeah. I will also say that the DHS folks they were super engaged and helpful, and just jumped right in with, as Marla has said, like they are thinking about this stuff. They really want to figure out ways to to sort of think about sort of family income and wealth, right? And so I think they'll be helpful in some of that kind of stuff, Rakaya, and we can gather some more specific questions, and then probably pull a subgroup together to, who wants to sort of pepper them with their own questions. Cynthia.
I just wanted to make sure that I'm a little clear too. With that, once you lose your benefits and you go over to the Health Link, I've been at the Health Link and it's expensive. Are we giving some type of healthcare dollars? I guess maybe the Build Back Better may better help with that if we get healthcare for everyone. But when you lose that free and start having to pay for it, I'm just a little worried that your income does not want to be lowered back down to a minimum wage when you have to pay so much of your income to the insurance. Are we figuring out if we decide that parent people would lose that, are they getting some additional dollars to offset that, or in some kind of way? Or is it going to be like a group? I know they forwarded everybody to the health, the healthcare network, but if it's if it's expensive for me, now, a person who is just getting an increase, it's going to be very hurtful to them.
Yep, for sure. And I think that's, I don't have an answer to your question, Cynthia, because I think that's exactly the question that we need to figure out. And so, because the reality is, and what you see, just to sort of get like a directional sense, the blue here is adult Medicaid. And the green is your health insurance marketplace subsidy. So you can see that the subsidy you get is worth a lot less than the benefit you lose, right? So yes, your point is exactly right. And I think part of the longer term conversation that we need to be having is about benefits.
Do we have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and again, part of this is, given the dollars that exist in the pay equity fund, how far do they go? And what are the other ways to support, long-term, a scenario in which providers can afford to actually give health benefits to their employees in ways that are not overly expensive for the employees, right? That's what we want down the line. But to your point, it's not that easy. We can't just say to employers like, all right, why don't you now just start delivering like fantastic health benefits that don't cost your employees anything, right? Like that's not, like they would be doing that already if they could, right?
Right.
So I think that these are all the right questions, and I think it's going to take some real digging into it to figure out some of the possibilities.
So the chart did not have anything with the contributions that businesses will make, because if you go through with your business is going to have to contribute a portion anyway. So the chart doesn't
It actually
shows that.
does, Cynthia. You can
It does.
choose that as it's not on that screenshot, but
Oh,
you
okay.
can choose
Okay.
if you go on that calculator, that's one of the things that you can choose in sort of designing.
Okay.
Um,
Thank you.
okay, Christina and Sinas, I'm going to give you the last word before we close out with some next steps.
I mean, just very quickly, anecdotally, I think the employer needs to contribute at least 50% of the health insurance. And that if you're a single person, and you might pay a lower rate, but if you have siblings, they only cover 50% of the employee, but not the dependents, so that you can have a very high cost of insurance if you have a family of 3 or 4. Anecdotally, just asking, providers, the insurance, the city insurance that they get, they don't pay anything. That, when they go to the doctor, they don't have to pay deductibles or anything like that, and they have very good service. That's why I'm so adamant about specifically the health insurance, and because I know that is almost cost prohibitive to employers to cover, that amount of the portion of that needs to be covered by the employer, unless, in the long term, we can find a way that the employers can provide at least the 75%, even though, they always said having the insurance. And I'm not saying if your salary compensates and you can pay, that's good, you pay your insurance. But if it doesn't compensate and you lose your insurance, that, puts people in a bind, because, health insurance it's a need.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. So, as we've said before in this group, keeping in mind that this health insurance challenge and benefits broadly that we're talking about, particularly health insurance, is not a child care specific issue, right? Like, this is a much broader issue. And so part of what I think we want to be thinking about is, are there broader solutions that that we can tap into and potentially, help inform and support in terms of some of the broader work that that DC is doing on this front, because as you all know, this is an issue for small businesses across the board, and we're certainly seeing it show up here, but wanting to make sure we're recognizing what are the things that are kind of within our specific wheelhouse versus things that we need to invite, more invite sort of broader support and expertise in. So here's some proposed next steps. So we started dropping in some of the, some of our sort of basic rationale and principles and some of the language that we've been looking at throughout these task force meetings into the, that table of contents you all have seen of a report. What I'm gonna propose here is that we will start to distinguish between things that are in that immediate triage, things that have to be decided in order to start moving things forward for the first round, and then things that that could hold off until post January 15th to continue working on. I am going to send all of you the link to that draft report. You can start going into it at any point and, perusing, dropping in comments. You may want to wait a minute to do that, or at least take a look to see how messy it looks. But I welcome, that ongoing, so that, that people can weigh in as you see things that, you want to add to or ask questions about or whatever. There are meetings on the calendar, and thank you to most of you who've opted into one of them on Friday and then next Tuesday, to have some more conversation around payment mechanism stuff, looking more at dollars, at basically both short-term and long-term. What do we think? Because one of the things we have to deliver for the council is, what do we think this actually is going to cost, what we're proposing? And so we want to start putting some of those dollar numbers to it. as part of that, we can look at some, beginning models of what our new compromise tier stipend might look like in terms of dollars. And then also Asi has been doing some work looking at what the longer term might look like in terms of, program level funding and how that would match some dollars. Some working group stuff moving forward. Refocusing the salary scale for the longer term. So again, like waiting a minute on that, not long, I promise, Marika, but it's just until we get some of this very initial stuff done, and particularly digging into that experience level piece that there's lots of question marks about. Establishing the accountability and oversight working groups. So some of you have already opted in that was a group that you were interested in when we asked early on, but I'll reopen that again. And then a benefits working group that's looking both at benefits cliffs issues and how we can mitigate in the immediate term, but also the longer term, like how are we thinking about the more comprehensive benefits piece. We've got task force meetings on the calendar on January 4th, Happy New Year, and January 13th. So there will certainly be additional meetings in between there that will start to calendar for some working groups. And the rest of this is just repeat from every meeting. It's 8:02. Apologies for going a little bit over. Thank you for everybody's level of engagement and willingness to sort of land on some specific recommendations. I know that it's hard when there's so many moving pieces here, and we're trying to do the sort of, y'all know, like the whole math instruction thing of spiraling, where you keep coming back to the same concepts, but they're just more advanced. I feel like that's what we keep doing, which I know can be challenging. So thank you for hanging in there, and we'll see most of you on Friday or Tuesday. But to everybody, I hope that people are finding some time to take a little break and rejuvenate over the holidays. Feel free to reach out with anything you have, any thoughts. Thanks
you.
all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Gracias. Okay. Oh my God. People.
We're still recording.
We're still recording, Abby.
So let me, how do I do stop recording first?
No, I've taken care of it. Just go on live on YouTube and click end.
I was never able to even get on the YouTube. So on YouTube.
You should see it right up there where it says live on YouTube in the left-hand corner.
I
can't do it. You have
Zoom.
to do it. Yep.
More.